Welcome to the nodding hour. Find a comfortable position, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow these quiet stories to carry you gently off to sleep. The workshop is quiet now. The last student left 20 minutes ago. The sound of the door closing, the key turning in the lock from the outside, and then this, which is the particular quiet of a room that has recently been occupied and is now not. A quiet that is fuller than the quiet of a room that has never been occupied, that carries in it the residue of the people who were here, their warmth still present in the air, their conversation gone, but its absence still faintly audible. The way a room after people is different from a room before them. The workshop occupies the ground floor of an old building on a quiet street. Its walls are exposed brick, dark red and slightly uneven. The mortar between the bricks soft and slightly crumbled in places near the floor, where the damp has worked its way in over the years. The ceiling is low and crossed by dark wooden beams, the original beams of the building, their underside slightly rough and dark with age. The floor is wide wooden boards, their surface worn smooth and slightly stained in various places, with wax and dye and the general evidence of years of the work that has been done here. The workbenches run along the two longer walls, long wooden surfaces at a comfortable standing height, their tops scarred and marked and slightly uneven from years of cutting and pouring, and the various small accidents of workshop work. Each bench has its tools arranged along the back. Rows of moulds in various sizes, some metal and some silicone, each one holding the shape of a particular candle. Ladles and pouring jugs in various sizes, thermometers, wicks on spools, small containers of dye in various colors, their lids slightly crusted with old pigment, a row of essential oil bottles, their labels handwritten in small, careful text. The smell of the workshop. This is its defining quality, the thing that makes it immediately and completely itself. The smell of wax, which is warm and slightly sweet, and slightly waxy in a way that has no better description than wax itself. A smell that is entirely distinctive and entirely pleasant, that fills the room completely and gives it its particular atmosphere. Beneath the wax smell, there are other smells, the various essential oils that have been used in various classes. Their individual scents present as faint notes in the general wax smell, lavender and citrus and something more complex and harder to name, all of them absorbed into the fabric of the room over years of making and melting and pouring. The candles that were made in today's class are on the cooling rack near the window. A row of them still in their molds, their surfaces slightly warm to the touch, the wax having contracted very slightly as it cooled from liquid to solid. The surfaces of the candles just visible above the rims of the molds, slightly irregular where the wax has contracted and pulled away from the smooth interior of the mold. They will be ready to unmold in the morning. The wax fully set and hard and cool. The candles complete and ready. For now they are just cooling, just doing what cooling wax does, which is to contract and harden and become the thing they were poured to be. Taking a stool from beneath the nearest bench and sitting at the bench. The stool is old and slightly wobbly on one leg, the leg having loosened at its joint over years of use and never been properly fixed. The wobble familiar and entirely manageable. The kind of imperfection that becomes part of the character of a thing over time, rather than a problem requiring solution. The bench surface at eye level from this sitting position is very detailed. Every mark and stain and cut and burn visible at close range, the history of the bench written in its surface, years of workshops and classes, and the particular small accidents of waxwork visible in the marks. A double boiler on the small gas ring at the end of the bench. A large pot of water with a smaller pot inside it. The water in the outer pot just barely warm from the last use of the class. Not boiling, not even very hot, just carrying the residual warmth of the afternoon's work. A block of beeswax in the inner pot, half melted from the class and now solid again as the heat has faded. The wax pale yellow and slightly translucent, where it is thin at the edges, and more opaque where it is thick at the center. The surface of it slightly rough where it hardened from its liquid state. The room very quiet around the bench. The street outside entirely silent. This is a quiet street at the best of times, and at this hour, there is nothing moving on it. No traffic, no footsteps, no voices. Just the occasional very distant sound of the town going about its evening business on streets further away. Sounds that arrive here as barely anything, as the faintest possible evidence that the world continues beyond the walls of the workshop. Turning on the gas ring. The small hiss of the gas, the click of the igniter, the soft sound of the flame catching and settling into its steady blue circle beneath the outer pot. The water beginning its very slow warming. The heat traveling gradually from the flame through the outer pot and the water and into the inner pot and the wax. The wax responding very slowly, the surface of it remaining solid, and still for several minutes before the first signs of softening appear at the edges. A slight glossiness, a very slight change in the surface texture. The wax beginning its transition from solid to liquid, watching the wax melt. There is very little that happens in a workshop that is as pleasant to watch as wax melting. The gradual change from the rough opacity of solid wax to the clear and slightly amber transparency of melted wax. The solid edges retreating as the liquid spreads from the warmest parts outward. The surface of the wax becoming level and still as it liquefies. All the roughness of the solid surface dissolving into the perfect smoothness of the liquid. The wax becoming something entirely different from what it was, while remaining entirely itself. The gas ring flame very small and steady beneath the pot. The wax in the inner pot becoming more liquid by degrees. Half solid and half liquid now. The solid portion floating slightly in the liquid portion. A pale island in a clear pale amber sea that grows smaller. As the liquid grows larger, the boundary between them moving very slowly inward, as the heat does its patient work. The smell of beeswax when it melts, stronger than the cold wax smell, more present, more specifically itself. The warm sweetness of it filling the immediate air, around the double boiler, and, drifting outward into the room. The smell of warmth and wax, and the particular organic quality of beeswax that distinguishes it from paraffin, that makes it smell like something alive, like something that was made by something living, which it was. The wax fully melted now, the inner pot holding a clear pale amber liquid, its surface perfectly still and perfectly level. The warmth from the gas ring below maintaining it at the right temperature. The thermometer reading the right number. The wax ready. Selecting a mold from the row along the back of the bench. A simple pillar mold, cylindrical. Its interior smooth and slightly shiny from previous use. Placing it on the bench in front of you, checking that it is level. Sealing the base with a small piece of putty pressed carefully around the joint between the mold and the bench. Preventing the liquid wax from finding its way out. The wick. Cutting a length from the spool. Threading it through the small hole in the base of the mold. Tying a small knot on the outside to anchor it. Then threading the top end through the small metal bar that rests across the top of the mold. Holding the wick perfectly centered and taut from base to top, ready for the wax that will surround it. The pouring jug, a small metal jug with a narrow spout and a wooden handle, its exterior slightly waxy from years of use. The wax on the handle built up in layers over many pourings, a record of all the candles that have passed through this jug, each layer from a different evening, a different pair of hands learning the same patient work, pouring. The jug tilted above the mold, the wax beginning to flow in a thin stream. The angle of the jug adjusted to control the flow. The amber liquid going in slowly and steadily. The level in the mold rising very gradually. The wick remaining centered as the wax rises around it. The surface of the wax in the mold perfectly smooth as it fills. The amber color of the melted wax catching the workshop's lamplight. And glowing slightly, the liquid wax warm and luminous, before it becomes the solid and opaque thing it will be when it is cool. Filling to within a centimeter of the top. The jug returned to upright. the last drop of wax landing on the surface and being absorbed, the surface smooth again, the mold placed carefully on the cooling rack, joining the others, the most recently poured candle among the row, its wax still clear and amber, the cooling beginning at its edges where the wax touches the metal mold, the bench wiped clean, the jug rinsed, the gas ring turned off, the double boiler beginning its slow cooling, the workshop at the end of its evening's work, everything done, everything in its place, the cooling rack holding its row of cooling candles, the room warm and quiet and smelling of beeswax, sitting back on the stool, the wobble on one leg still there, familiar and entirely fine. A candle on the shelf above the bench, an older one, slightly dusty, its wick trimmed and slightly blackened. Taking it down and placing it on the bench, the matchbox in the small drawer. A match struck, the brief flare, the sulfur smell, and then the flame finding the wick and settling into its steady small burn. The overhead lamp switched off, the workshop going immediately to candlelight, warm and amber, and making a small, sufficient world of the bench, and the person at it, everything else in the room, in a comfortable dimness, present but peripheral, the candlelight drawing its circle around the essential things. The workshop by candlelight, entirely different from the workshop by overhead light, more intimate, more interior. The warm circle of the candle's light making a small and sufficient world of the bench, and the immediate tools and the person sitting at it. Everything else in the room present, but peripheral. The candlelight drawing a circle around the essential things, and leaving everything else in its comfortable dark. The candle flame. Watching it without any particular intention, just watching it burn. The small and steady flame doing its continuous work, consuming the wick and the wax at the same slow rate, maintaining its height and its brightness within a very small range, adjusting for variations so small they are invisible. The flame a self-regulating system that has been managing itself since it was lit, and will continue to manage itself until the wax is gone, which is a long time from now. The cooling rack just visible in the candlelight. The row of moulds, their contents in various stages of cooling. The most recently poured one still slightly amber at its center, where the warmth lingers, the others fully opaque and pale, their surfaces beginning to develop the slight roughness of cooled wax that has contracted away from the smooth mold interior. They will be unmolded in the morning, the mold inverted and the candle tapped out, the finished thing revealed, smooth and pale and complete, the wick protruding from the top, ready to be trimmed and lit for the first time. The smell of the room, the overhead lamp off and the gas ring off, and the class finished and gone. The smell of the room is settling into its night state. The beeswax smell still present and very specific, the essential oil notes still faintly present beneath it, the warmth of the room still carrying the smell of the evening's work, the room smelling of what it is and what it has been doing, which is making candles, which is a very good thing to smell of. The street outside the workshop window, entirely quiet. A quiet street at the best of times, and at this hour, whenever this hour is, entirely still. No traffic, no footsteps, no voices, just the occasional distant sound of the town on other streets, a sound that arrives here as barely anything. The workshop sealed against the outside by its walls and its locked door. The quiet of the street outside adding to the quiet of the inside. The two quiets layered over each other. The inside quiet the warmer and more present of the two. The outside quiet the darker and more extensive. The candle burned steadily. The wax pool around its base clear and still. The flame straight and small and entirely self-sufficient, making its light in the dark workshop with complete and patient competence. The light it throws on the bench surface is warm and slightly orange, making the grain of the wood visible and warm-looking, making the marks and stains in the bench surface look like deliberate decoration rather than the accidental record of work. The candlelight being generous in this way, making things look better than they might in harsher light, or rather, making them look exactly as good as they are, which is very good in the case of an old bench in an old workshop at the end of an evening. The tools along the back of the bench, The moulds in their row, each one a slightly different shape, each one the form of a particular candle. The ladles and pouring jugs upside down on their cloths, the thermometers in their stand, the wick spools, the dye containers, the essential oil bottles with their handwritten labels, just readable in the candlelight: lavender, bergamot, sandalwood, cedar, forest, winter spice. A row of small brown bottles holding their scents, waiting for the next class, the next hands, the next evening, of pouring and cooling and the warm smell of melted beeswax filling the room. Nothing required, nothing expected. The workshop at rest around the candle, around the person at the bench, around the cooling rack and the cooling candles and the cooling double boiler. Everything done for this evening, everything in its place. The room warm and dim and entirely itself, smelling of beeswax and candlelight and old wood, and the particular combination of these things that makes this room what it is, which is a workshop where candles are made, which is a warm and amber, an entirely pleasant thing to be. The candle flame steady and small on the bench, the room quiet, the street outside quiet, the evening long and settled and entirely sufficient. Nothing left to do, nowhere left to be. Just this warm and amber and beeswax smelling room, and this small steady flame, and this quiet that is complete and asks nothing, and offers everything, and will hold this workshop and its cooling candles and its tools in order, until morning comes, and the class comes, and the wax is melted again, and the work begins again, which it will, which it always does, which is entirely fine and entirely good. The candle burns, the wax cools, the room rests, everything warm and quiet and still and at rest. The wax is fully melted. The inner pot holds a clear, pale amber liquid, its surface perfectly still and perfectly level. The warmth from the gas ring below maintaining it at the right temperature, warm enough to pour, not so hot that it will shrink excessively as it cools. The thermometer in the pot reads the right number. The wax is ready, the moulds. Selecting from the row along the back of the bench, a simple pillar mold, cylindrical, its interior smooth and slightly shiny from previous use, the surface of it holding the faint impression of many previous candles in its slight smoothness. Placing it on the bench in front of you, checking that it is level, that the base is sealed, a small piece of putty pressed around the base to prevent the wax from leaking when it is poured. An essential step, a step that becomes automatic after enough repetitions, the wick, cutting a length from the spool, long enough to reach from the base of the mold to above the top with enough left to hold in position, threading it through the small hole in the base of the mold, tying a small knot on the outside to hold it, then threading the top end through a small metal bar that rests across the top of the mold, holding the wick centered and taut, the wick suspended in the exact center of the mold from top to bottom, ready for the wax. The pouring jug, transferring some of the melted wax from the inner pot to the pouring jug, a small metal jug with a narrow spout and a wooden handle, its exterior slightly waxy from years of use, the wax on the handle built up in layers over many pourings, a record of all the candles that have been poured with this jug, each layer a different class, a different evening, a different person's first attempt or practice competence. Pouring, holding the jug above the mold, tilting it slowly, the wax beginning to flow. A thin stream at first, the angle of the jug, adjusted to control the flow. The wax going in slowly and steadily, the level in the mold rising very gradually, the wick remaining centered as the wax rises around it, the surface of the wax in the mold perfectly smooth as it fills, the amber color of the melted wax catching the workshop's lamplight, and glowing slightly, the liquid wax a warm and slightly luminous thing, before it becomes the solid and opaque thing it will be when it is cool, filling to within a centimeter of the top, the jug tilted back to its upright position, the last drop of wax falling from the spout and landing on the surface of the poured candle. A very small disturbance that is absorbed immediately. The surface smooth again. Setting the jug down. Looking at the poured candle in its mold. A clear, pale amber cylinder of liquid wax with a white wick running through its center. Entirely still, entirely level. Cooling already at its edges where the wax touches the metal of the mold. A second mold. Selecting it from the row. A slightly different shape this time, tapered toward the base. The form of a classic taper candle made in a mold rather than dipped. Its interior smooth and clean, waiting. The same process, sealing the base, threading the wick, positioning the bar. The jug refilled from the inner pot. The wax still at the right temperature, still clear and amber, and perfectly liquid. Pouring again, the same slow, careful tilt, the same steady stream, the same rising level in the new mold. The wick remaining centered, the surface smooth. The two molds on the cooling rack. Side by side, both still amber and clear at their centers. Both cooling from the outside inward. The wax at the edges of each mold becoming opaque and pale while the center remains liquid. The boundary between the two states moving very slowly inward as the cooling progresses. A third mold, a sphere. Its two halves joined at the equator with a careful seal of putty. The wick threaded through a hole at the top and centered through the middle of the sphere. Pouring more carefully this time, the spherical mold less stable than the cylindrical ones. The level in it harder to judge. The pour slower and more attentive, the wax going in a finer stream. The surface of it watched more carefully, filling to the right level. The mold placed on the rack with more care, a small piece of folded cloth, supporting it on each side to prevent it rolling. 3 molds on the cooling rack now. 3 different shapes, 3 different sizes, all filled with the same clear amber wax, all cooling toward the same pale and opaque solid that wax becomes when it is finished. Each one the beginning of a candle that is not yet a candle, that is in the process of becoming one, that will be unmolded in the morning as a finished thing. The inner pot still holding wax, enough for one more small mold, perhaps, or enough to be covered and saved for the next class. Covering it with a piece of foil pressed down onto the surface of the wax, the foil preventing a skin from forming on the surface as the wax cools, keeping it clean and ready. The gas ring very low now, just enough heat to keep the wax liquid for another few minutes before it is turned off entirely. The bench, a small spillage of wax near the pouring position, a few drops that fell from the jug or the mold during the work. Now solid on the bench surface, small flat pools of pale wax that have hardened into the grain of the wood, scraping them off carefully with a palette knife, the wax coming away cleanly, leaving a slight ghost of itself in the wood grain that will be there permanently, added to all the other ghosts of all the other small spills of all the other evenings of work on this bench. The essential oils, a small selection of bottles from the row along the back of the bench, lavender, cedar wood, something called deep forest that smells of pine and wet earth, and something darker and more resinous beneath both, adding a few drops of each to a small ceramic bowl, mixing them with a small glass rod, the combined smell rising immediately from the bowl, the 3 scents finding their combination, the lavender providing the high note and the cedar, the middle, and the forest the deep bass, the whole thing working together into something that is more than its parts, that is a particular and specific scent, rather than 3 separate ones. Adding this to the remaining melted wax in the inner pot, the drops going in slowly, the rod stirring the wax very gently to distribute the scent through the liquid, the smell of the wax changing immediately as the oils disperse through it, the sweetness of the beeswax taking on the added complexity of the oils, the workshop smell shifting slightly, becoming something richer and more layered than plain beeswax, still warm and still amber, but with these added dimensions running through it. Pouring a small mold with this scented wax, a simple tea light mold, just a small aluminum cup with a wick already in place, the wax going in very quickly, the mold full in seconds, the scented wax filling the small cup and setting immediately at the edges, placing it on the rack. The smell from it already present in the air immediately around it, the heat of the liquid wax releasing the essential oils into the room. The workshop smelling now of beeswax and lavender, and cedar and forest, a combination that is entirely pleasant and entirely specific to the small cup of scented wax cooling on the rack. The gas ring turned off, the double boiler beginning its cooling, the wax in the inner pot beginning to develop its surface skin, the liquid losing its perfect levelness as the skin contracts very slightly, the edge of the skin pulling away from the sides of the pot in a very fine line that marks the boundary between liquid and solid, the pot entering the same process of cooling and contracting that the molds on the rack are undergoing, just without a mold to shape it, just cooling in the round pot into whatever shape the cooling wax finds when it is not constrained. The bench cleaned, the jug rinsed, the tools wiped and returned to their positions along the back of the bench, the mold bar and the putty back in their small container, the palette knife wiped clean of its small wax scrapings, the thermometer dried and placed back in its stand. Everything in its place, the bench returning to its state of organized readiness for the next class, the next pour, the next evening of work. The cooling rack, 5 molds now, the 3 from the earlier pouring, and the tea light and one more small pillar that was poured from the last of the unscented wax before the gas was turned off. 5 different shapes and sizes and scents on the rack. 5 candles in the process of becoming themselves, the wax in all of them cooling at its own pace, the larger ones slower and the smaller ones faster, all of them patient, all of them doing what cooling wax does, which is to contract and harden and become. Sitting back on the stool, the wobble still there, the bench clear in front of you, the candle on the bench, the old one taken from the shelf earlier, now the only light in the workshop after the overhead lamp was switched off, its flame making its warm circle on the bench surface and the tools along the back, and the cooling rack to the left, and nothing else. The walls and the ceiling in comfortable shadow. The smell of the workshop now, the plain beeswax smell enriched by the essential oils, the lavender and cedar, and forest blend that was added to the tea light wax, still present in the air of the room, still being released by the warm wax in the cooling rack, the scent drifting outward from the tea light mold and dispersing through the room, mixing with the general wax smell, adding its particular notes to the general atmosphere. The street outside, still entirely silent, the workshop still entirely its own warm and dim and scented world, sealed against the outside by the walls and the door. The quiet of the inside more complete and more present than the quiet of the outside. The workshop at this hour in this candlelight, the most interior and self-contained place imaginable, requiring nothing from outside and offering nothing to it. Just warm and amber, and smelling of beeswax and lavender and cedar and the cooling of wax and molds on a rack in a quiet room. The candle flame still straight and steady. The wax pool around it still clear and still. The flame having burned perhaps 1/4 of an inch down the wick since it was lit, which is not much, which represents an hour or so of burning, which means there is a great deal of candle left, which means the light will continue for a long time yet, which is entirely fine, which is more than enough. The cooling rack, looking at it from the stool in the candlelight, 5 molds in a row, their contents at various stages of the cooling process, the most recently poured ones still showing a slight amber transparency at their centers, the earlier ones fully opaque and pale, their surfaces developing the slight irregularity of cooled wax that has contracted away from the mold interior. The tea light already fully cool, its small aluminum cup holding a disc of pale solid wax with the wick protruding from its center. The scent still present in it, still being released very faintly into the air of the room. The process of cooling. Thinking about it while watching the molds on the rack. The wax moving from liquid to solid, not all at once, but from the outside inward. The parts of the wax in contact with the cold mold cooling first. The interior staying liquid and warm longer. The solid boundary moving very slowly inward as the heat conducts outward through the solid outer layer. and through the metal of the mold and into the air of the room. A very slow process, a patient process, the wax doing it in its own time at its own pace. Not to be hurried, not amenable to hurrying, even if hurrying were attempted. The beeswax. Thinking about that too, while the candle burns and the rack cools. The particular material, where it comes from, what it is, made by bees from the nectar of flowers. The bees consuming the honey and secreting the wax from glands on their abdomens, building their combs from it, the most efficient building material in nature. Hexagonal cells of pure wax, holding the honey and the larvae. The entire structure of the hive, depending on this material that the bees make from the flowers. The wax harvested from the combs and rendered and filtered and formed into blocks and sold to workshops like this one, where it is melted and poured and shaped into candles that burn with the particular quality that beeswax burns, which is clean and warm and slightly golden, which is the light of the flowers that the bees visited, transformed into something that illuminates the evenings of people who had nothing to do with the flowers or the bees. The candle on the bench, made from the same material, burning with the same clean golden flame. The flowers in it, distantly, transform past recognition, but present somewhere in the chemistry of the burning. The energy of the sun that fell on the flowers that fed the bees that made the wax. That is this candle burning on this bench in this workshop at this hour. The thought not requiring any conclusion, just present, just part of the evening's quietness, just one of the things that the candlelight and the beeswax smell and the cooling rack invite the mind toward without any particular urgency. The workshop around the candle, the bench with its marks and stains, the tools in their row, the cooling rack with its moulds, the double boiler on the gas ring, fully cool now, the wax in the inner pot solid and covered with its foil, waiting for the next class, the walls with their exposed brick, the beams above, the wide wooden floor with its wax stains, the street outside, quiet, everything done, everything in its place, the evening's work complete, the wax poured and the tools cleaned, and the bench wiped and the gas off, and the overhead lamp off, and just this, just the candle and its light and its smell, and the cooling rack and the quiet room, and the particular completeness of a workspace at the end of the good evening's work. Everything attended to, everything orderly, everything ready for tomorrow. The candle flame very steady, the pool of wax around it slightly wider than it was when the candle was first lit, the candle itself fractionally shorter, the work of burning continuing at its own unhurried pace, the flame taking what it needs from the wax and giving in return, its light and its warmth and its slight sweet smell. The exchange that candles have been making since the first person pressed a wick into a pool of fat or wax and found that it burned, and that the burning was useful and pleasant. Sitting on the stool with the wobble in its leg, in the warm beeswax-smelling workshop in the candlelight, with the cooling rack and the tools, and the bench and everything at rest, and the candle burning its steady burn, and nothing required and nothing expected, and the evening long and quiet and entirely sufficient, and the street outside entirely still, and the workshop entirely its own warm and amber and self-contained world. Nothing left to do. The rack will cool on its own. The wax will set on its own. The morning will come on its own, and the candles will be unmolded, and the class will arrive, and the gas will be lit, and the wax will be melted again, and the cycle will continue as it always continues, patient and unhurried and entirely reliable. But that is morning. That is another time entirely. This is now. This is the workshop at rest. This is the candle burning. This is the beeswax smell and the warm amber light and the quiet and the cooling rack and the stool with its wobble and the bench with its marks, and everything still and warm and at rest and entirely, completely, perfectly enough. The candle has been burning for some time. The wax in the pool at its base has widened as the flame has worked its way down through the wick. The pool of liquid wax around the base of the flame, clear and still and slightly amber. The light from the flame reflecting in it in a small and perfect circle. The wick has shortened very slightly, the burnt portion of it curled slightly to one side, the flame maintaining its straight and steady burn regardless. The cooling rack, looking at it from the stool, the row of molds, the wax in them at various stages of cooling. The most recently poured mold now fully opaque at its surface, the wax having cooled to its outer skin, though the interior is still warm, still contracting very slowly toward its final solid state. The other molds fully cool, their surfaces hard and slightly rough, where the wax has contracted away from the smooth interior of the mold. A slight depression in the surface of each one at the top, where the contraction has pulled the wax down, a small crater that will need to be topped up with a second pour of wax in the morning to level the surface of the finished candle. The smell of the workshop at this point in the evening. The melted wax smell has faded slightly as the double boiler has cooled. The most volatile part of the smell gone with the heat. What remains is the deeper, cooler smell of the room itself. The accumulated wax smell of years. The smell of the wooden benches and the brick walls and the beams above. The smell of a room that has been used for this work for a long time and has absorbed the evidence of it completely into its fabric. And above this, the smell of the burning candle. The same beeswax smell, but warmer and more present. The smell of wax in its burning state. Slightly more complex, slightly more itself. The tools along the back of the bench. In their places, cleaned and arranged, ready for the next class. The molds in their row, each one slightly different in size and shape, each one the form of a particular candle that has been poured in it many times, and will be poured in it many times more. The ladles and pouring jugs upside down on their drying cloths, the thermometers in their stand, the wick spools with their colored labels, the dye containers with their slightly crusted lids, the essential oil bottles in their row, their handwritten labels just readable in the candlelight, the candle flame, watching it, not looking for anything in it, not waiting for anything from it, just watching it burn, the small and steady flame doing its continuous work, consuming the wick and the wax at the same slow rate, maintaining its height and its brightness within a very small range, adjusting for variations so small they are invisible. The flame a self-regulating system that has been managing itself since it was lit, and will continue to manage itself until the wax is gone, which is a long time from now. The flame is slightly brighter at its base and slightly cooler at its tip. The hottest part of the flame, the blue at the base of the inner cone. The yellow outer flame, cooler and more orange toward the tip. The whole thing a small and very efficient engine of combustion that produces more light and less soot than almost any other kind of candle. The beeswax burning cleanly and completely. The flame steady and entirely self-sufficient. A slight movement of the air in the room. Almost nothing. Just the very faint circulation of warm air rising from the candle and cool air settling from the corners of the room. The natural convection of a warm enclosed space, too slight to be felt on the face, but just sufficient to move the candle flame very slightly. The flame leaning a fraction to one side and then returning to its upright position. The movement over in a second, the flame straight again. The cooling wax in the molds on the rack, moving very slightly in the molds of the most recently poured candles as the contraction continues. Not visibly moving, just very slightly changing at the margins. The surface of the wax finding its final level, as the last of the heat works its way out through the sides of the mold, and the wax reaches its final solid temperature, which is the temperature of the room, which is warm from the evening's work, which is the right temperature for cooling candles in a workshop at this hour. The stool wobbles very slightly as you shift your weight on it. The familiar wobble, the familiar adjustment, the familiar settling. The bench surface in front of you, lit by the candle, its marks and stains all visible in the warm light. All the accumulated evidence of all the work done here. All the classes and all the students and all the candles poured and cooled and unmolded and taken home. all of it present in the surface of the bench in the candlelight, the double boiler on the gas ring, fully cool now, the water in the outer pot at room temperature, the wax in the inner pot solid again, pale and opaque, its surface smooth where it cooled slowly and evenly, a small depression at the center where the last of the liquid wax contracted as it solidified, a perfect small crater that mirrors the craters in the tops of the cooling candles on the rack. The workshop very still around the candle. The bench and the tools and the rack and the moulds and the double boiler and the walls and the beams and the wide wooden floor all in the candlelight or just at the edge of it, all present and quiet and at rest in the way that like workshops are at rest when the work is done and the students have gone and the wax has been poured and the gas has been turned off and the overhead light has been switched off and there is just this, just the candle on the bench and the warm amber light it makes in the quiet room. The candle flame is steady. The room is warm. The cooling candles on the rack are cooling. The wax in the double boiler is solid. The tools are clean and in their places. Everything done that needed doing, everything in its place. The workshop at the end of an evening of candle making resting in its own warm and waxy quiet. The smell of beeswax in the air. The light of beeswax on the bench. The warmth of the room from the evening's work still present in the walls and the air and the wide wooden floor. The moulds on the rack. Looking at them for a long time in the candlelight, watching the cooling process at the stage it has reached, which is the stage where the visible changes are almost imperceptible. The wax fully opaque in all the moulds now. The slight depression at the top of each one fully formed. The surface of each candle just visible above the rim of its mould. Pale and slightly rough and entirely patient. By morning, they will be cool enough to unmold. The metal of the mold gently squeezed to release the wax's contact with the sides. The mold inverted, the finished candle sliding out into the hand, smooth and pale and complete. The wick protruding from the top, the candle ready to be trimmed and lit. The thought of the finished candles, each one a specific shape, a specific scent, a specific combination of wax and wick and whatever essential oils went into it. Each one the product of this particular evening's work, this particular combination of wax and heat and hands. They will go home with whoever made them or will be sold. Or will sit on a shelf somewhere and be lit eventually on some other evening in some other room. Their flame burning with the same clean, golden quality that all beeswax candles burn, making the same warm amber light, the same slight sweet smell, the same steady flame in the still air. The old candle on the bench, still burning, its flame unchanged. The pool of wax around it slightly wider than it was an hour ago. The candle itself slightly shorter. The work of burning continuing. How many hours has it been burning since it was on the shelf, unlit and dusty? Before this evening, impossible to say. It was partly burned when it came down from the shelf, its wick already shortened by previous burnings. The wax already reduced from its original height. How many evenings has it illuminated this bench, this workshop? Whoever was sitting on this stool? Also impossible to say. Just that it has, and is, and will continue to, until the wax is entirely consumed, which will be on some other evening, not this one. The workshop holds its quiet. The brick walls hold the warmth of the evening. The beams above hold their dark age. The floor holds its wax stains and its worn paths. The bench holds its history of work. The rack holds its cooling candles. The tools hold their places along the back of the bench. Everything held, everything in its place, everything at rest. The smell of beeswax, still very present. The most present thing in the room at this point, besides the candle flame itself. The smell that belongs to this room more than any other smell. That is this room's particular and defining quality, that anyone who has ever been in this workshop would recognize immediately if they walked in now. The smell of years of beeswax melted and poured and burned on this bench in this room. With these tools, the smell of the work that has been done here and continues to be done here, warm and sweet and entirely its own. sitting on the stool, the candle in front, the rack to the left, the tools behind, the warm brick walls around, the beams above, the quiet street outside the window. The evening long and settled and entirely sufficient, holding the workshop and everything in it in its quiet and patient way, as evenings hold workshops and all the things in them, as this particular evening holds this particular workshop, with its particular smell and its particular light and its particular cooling rack of candles and its particular person on a stool with a wobble in one leg, watching a beeswax candle burn on a bench, the candle flame, very present, the most moving thing in the room, the only thing that moves with any regularity, the occasional very slight lean in response to some imperceptible current in the air, the return to upright, the constant very slight variation in brightness as the flame adjusts its combustion to the wax it is consuming, all of this happening continuously and very quietly, the flame managing itself entirely, requiring nothing from anyone, burning because it is burning, making its light, because light is what it makes, the light it throws on the bench, the grain of the wood warm and detailed in the amber light, every mark and stain and cut, a small shadow in the candlelight, the bench surface more present and more particular than it is in any other light. The candlelight being the light that shows things most truly or most kindly, depending on how you think about it, which may be the same thing. The tools along the back of the bench. In the candlelight, they are warm shapes and shadows. The moulds in their row, the jugs and ladles upside down on their cloths, the thermometers in their stand, the essential oil bottles with their handwritten labels, all of them known, all of them in their places, all of them waiting for the next class in the patient way that tools wait for the next use, which is just by being there, just by continuing to exist in their places on the bench, ready without knowing they are ready, available without being available to themselves. The rack, all 5 moulds now fully cool, the last warmth having left them in the past half hour. The wax in all of them at room temperature, fully solid, fully contracted, the slight depressions at the tops of all of them fully formed. 5 finished candles in their moulds, waiting to be unmolded in the morning. Their work of becoming almost complete. Just the unmolding left, just the moment of inversion and release that will reveal the finished thing, pale and smooth and complete. The room cooling very slightly as the evening advances, and the walls give back the last of the warmth they absorbed from the gas ring and the melting wax. Not cold, the room retaining its essential warmth, the brick walls having absorbed enough heat to remain warm for some hours yet. Just slightly less warm than it was at the height of the evening's work, the temperature settling towards something that will be the temperature of the room through the night, which is cool but comfortable, which is the right temperature for a workshop full of cooling candles. The candle, still burning, its flame unchanged in quality, though the candle itself continues its slow work of becoming shorter, the wax being consumed at its steady and unhurried rate, the pool of wax around the flame clear and warm and still. The light it makes is the same light it has made all evening, completely consistent, entirely reliable, warm and amber, and making its small sufficient world of the bench, and the tools in the rack, and the person on the stool. Nothing required. The rack will finish cooling on its own. The tools will wait in their places on their own. The bench will hold its marks on its own. The room will hold its warmth on its own. The candle will burn on its own until it is done. All of it entirely self-sufficient, entirely independent of any attention or effort. Just continuing as it has been continuing and will continue. The breath very slow. The body on the stool very still. The wobble in the leg making its very slight adjustment and settling. The workshop around you warm and quiet and dim in the candlelight. The brick walls close on every side, the beams low above. The wide wooden floor below, everything familiar, and present and entirely at rest. The smell of beeswax, the light of beeswax, the warmth of the room, the quiet of the street outside, the cooling rack, the bench, the tools, the candle, everything still, everything warm, everything at rest. The candle burns its steady burn, and the wax cools in its moulds. And the room holds its warmth, and the workshop holds the room, and the quiet street holds the workshop, and the evening holds everything in its long and patient and entirely sufficient way. And there is nothing left to do, and nowhere to be, and the workshop is warm, and the candle is burning, and the beeswax smell is in the air, and the cooling rack holds its candles, and everything is still, and quiet, and warm, and entirely, completely, peacefully at rest. The flame burns, the wax holds its warmth, the room is still, and the evening continues its quiet work of passing, unhurried and entirely sufficient, as evenings always do, as this one does, as the candle burns, and the wax cools, and the workshop rests in its warm amber quiet until morning. That's all for tonight at the Nodding Hour. If these stories helped you rest, subscribe so you never miss a new one. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.